Hi, I'm Jan Seymour-Ford, and I'm a senior Dharma teacher with Empty Moon. And this is a reflection on the second precept, not stealing. Most religions and moral codes have an admonition against stealing, and Buddhism is no exception. But it doesn't stop with merely not stealing things. I love how this precept widens the experience. We also take up the way of taking only what is freely given. It reminds us that our actions and we ourselves are interconnected. Not stealing. When I reflect on the admonition to refrain from stealing, I think about my own greed or entitlement and an object I want to grasp. It's a narrow focus on 2 points, me and the coveted object. If I listen only to the first part of the precept, the instruction not to take someone else's stuff, it can be lifeless and static. It ignores and excludes the rest of the world. I was raised to be meticulous about not stealing objects. My parents were the kind of people who would march the entire family back to the supermarket to pay if we bought 3 cans of tomatoes but were accidentally charged for only 2. This was accompanied with a certain amount of self-congratulation. For whatever reason, that rectitude really stuck with me. So stealing objects is not very tempting to me, and it never really was. That's probably true of most of us in this practice. But in our readings this week, in his book Being Upright, Reb Anderson says, in discussing this precept, students often have difficulty finding examples of stealing in their own behavior. But these same people readily admit how often they take things that are not wholeheartedly given. This makes things interesting suddenly. The second precept in its fullness is the way of not stealing and the way of taking only what is freely given. As Tom says in his video talk, our language and words create the world in which we live, taking us out of our heads and into our lives. And these words remind us that we live in relationship. The way of taking only what is freely given can be lived only in our interconnectedness. When I merely refrain from taking what doesn't belong to me, that's a narrow form of rectitude. When I expand my focus to consider whether something is freely given to me, I realize that this precept is dynamic. Giving, taking, intention. Another person or a whole bunch of people are involved. Stealing, not stealing, giving and taking all exist in a living web. I'm reminded that all my behavior, giving and taking, is intimate and alive. When I live the way of taking only what is freely given, everything is multidimensional and interrelated. Years ago, I worked in organizations founded by Quakers. Quakers practice spiritual self-examination by meditating on moral queries. There's a line from an old Buffy St. Marie song that has always stuck with me. It's a query for the precept of not stealing. Can't you see that their poverty is profiting you? It compels me to think about deep consequences, even through the generations. Here are some more queries. How do we live the precept of not stealing when the land we live on was stolen hundreds of years ago? Is it stealing when we buy goods made in a sweatshop? Years ago, I was a typesetter. I once worked on a book about ancient Buddhist teaching stories. In one of the stories, a monk is working in the kitchen, preparing the meal for the monastery. He transfers the rice from the pot to the serving bowl and notices that there are 5 grains of rice clinging to the utensil. He impulsively eats them, and as a consequence, after he dies, he spends 5 years in hell, 1 for each grain of rice. We don't tell many stories like that when in Zen. Its harshness shocked me a bit, but there's a reason why this story has stayed with me all these years. We cause harm when we take what is meant for the nourishment of others. We are stealing when our comfort causes misery for others. And yet, I break this precept over and over, daily. Diane Rossetto, in her book waking up to what we do, reminds us that quite often what fuels this need for attainment is the belief of not enoughness, insufficiency, lack. Last week I found a book in one of those little free libraries entitled The Bee Season by Mila Goldberg. Interestingly, it includes a character who's tormented by a feeling of emptiness and incompleteness. This feeling compels her to shoplift, looking for the object that will finally make her feel whole. Here's another query. What do I lack? What do I grasp at in the belief that it will finally make me feel whole? During my working life, I loved shawls and scarves. I got kind of obsessive about them. On the surface, my drive for more accessories came from a desire to appear polished and professional and stylish. Legitimate enough, I guess. But really, I realized that it was a desire to cover up the fear that I was never accomplished enough, never professional enough, and never good enough. Here's another query. What am I really grasping for when I covet? And what do I think I need to cover up? Diane Rossetto shares some good advice from one of her students. At times when I feel I am entitled to what others want, need, or own, I resolve to hold this hard ball of entitlement, of separation, to feel its texture, and to wait until its nature is clear. I love how Diane Rossetto expands even further on the precept of not taking what is not freely given. She adds, taking up the way of giving freely of all that I can. She asks us to ponder how open we are with the spirit of giving our time, energy, talents, and commitment. Here's some more queries. How do I damage relationship and our interconnectedness when I curl up like a pill bug and don't share my time, my energy, and my heart? How do I steal when I turn away from the suffering of another? How do I steal when I refuse to give what's needed right now? I grew up among a family that was deeply affected by the Great Depression. I was trained to be cautious, not to be generous. I can still remember the physical sensation of fear at the thought of giving too much away. It felt like it was a cupboard that would be left empty and incomplete and vulnerable, unable to take care of myself. This practice is my teacher in generosity of spirit, and it has taught me that generosity is like the ocean of compassion. It never diminishes and never runs dry. This precept of not stealing and not taking what is not freely given and giving freely of all that we can gives us two invitations. The way of not stealing invites us to examine our ethical behavior. The way of taking only what is freely given and the way of freely giving all that I can invite us to experience gratitude and generosity in our interconnectedness. Thank you.